It was supposed to be just another transatlantic flight, London-bound, first-class cabin, the quiet hum of engines promising hours of peace. But somewhere over the Atlantic, tension began to ripple through the air, sparked by a demand that would change the course of the journey for everyone watching. A well-known passenger, accustomed to being treated like royalty, wanted a seat that wasn't his. A senior crew member, confident in her authority, saw only what she thought she knew about the woman sitting there. And in the middle of it all sat Dr. Amani Rhodes, calm, composed, her eyes steady as the storm gathered around her. What happens when quiet strength meets loud entitlement? How can dignity shift the balance of power in a space as small and pressurized as an aircraft cabin? And how can one moment, one choice ripple all the way from a leather seat at 35,000 feet to the boardrooms of London's financial district stay with me? Because this is not just about a flight. It's about perception, prejudice, and the kind of power you never see coming. Before we take off into this story, make sure to like, share, and subscribe so you don't miss the landing. The cabin lights glowed a soft gold, reflecting off polished metal trim and the glass partition that separated the boarding area from the forward business class pods. Dr. Amani Rhodes stepped through the doorway of North Star Atlantic Flight 318, bound from Newark to London Gatwick, and felt that familiar rush of recycled air. It carried with it the faint scent of brewed coffee and that curious mix of leather, fabric, and anticipation. She had been on hundreds of flights in her career, but tonight, the moment she stepped aboard, she felt the weight of the week settle on her shoulders. In the past 7 days, she had packed up her father's apartment in Atlanta, sold furniture she once sat on as a teenager, and moved him into an assisted living facility that, while comfortable, still felt like surrender. The transition had been gentle but final. It left her feeling both relieved and hollow. Her seat assignment was 2A, not the most spacious suite on the aircraft, but one she chose with precision. It was by the window, forward-facing, angled just enough to give privacy from the aisle. On long-haul flights, Amani preferred this quiet corner, a place to think, to write, and sometimes to simply breathe without interruption. The boarding area around her hummed with the muted chaos of passengers stowing bags, adjusting coats, and offering polite excuses. She nodded to a flight attendant greeting customers at the door, who barely looked up from scanning boarding passes. That was fine. She wasn't here for recognition. Sliding her carry-on into the overhead, she kept one item in hand, a slim, black leather portfolio. Inside were documents that would occupy most of her time once airborne: a draft agreement for Project Aegis, a $900 million strategic partnership between her firm, Helios Meridian Partners, and North Star Atlantic's cargo division. If signed in London tomorrow, it would give the struggling airline a lifeline and secure HMP a powerful foothold in transatlantic logistics. She placed the portfolio in the small storage space beside her seat. The feel of its weight was reassuring, like carrying a shield, settling into 2A. She fastened her belt loosely and let her gaze drift to the window. Beyond it, service vehicles moved under the sodium-orange glow of tarmac lights. A ground crew member in a high-visibility vest signaled to another near the cargo hold. Somewhere in the background, the low hum of the APU filled the air. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening. Breathe in. Breathe out, a voice in her head whispered. You just need these 6 hours to yourself. No calls, no family decisions, just quiet. The sound of laughter pulled her from her thoughts. It came from behind her, in row 4, a young man's voice, loud, brash, talking about follower counts and brand deals. She didn't turn around. It wasn't her business. Still, the tone had that edge of entitlement she recognized instantly. Amani opened her eyes and reached for the small bottle of water placed neatly in her side compartment. She took a sip, letting the coolness calm her throat. She pulled out her tablet, ready to review the latest numbers for tomorrow's meeting. The boarding process slowed as the last few passengers filed in. Overhead, bins clicked shut. A soft chime announced that the doors would close soon. Amani exhaled again. The cabin's energy began to settle. This was her space now, for the next 6 hours. Or so she thought. From the corner of her vision, she noticed a uniformed figure pausing by row 4, leaning in to speak with the loud young man. She saw his broad smile widen, his gestures quick and familiar, like someone used to being accommodated. The flight attendant, tall, brunette, a little harried, nodded and offered him the kind of grin that said, "Let me see what I can do." Amani looked away, refocusing on her screen. It wasn't unusual for crews to shuffle seats before takeoff. Sometimes it was for weight distribution, sometimes for passengers with special needs. Sometimes for reasons less official. She told herself it had nothing to do with her, but somewhere deep down, an old and familiar caution flickered. The hum of boarding faded into the pre-departure rhythm safety checks, quiet conversations, the clink of service carts in the galley. Amani adjusted her scarf, the silk cool against her neck, and tried to push aside the flicker of unease. Tomorrow's meeting would demand her full focus. Lionel Hart, North Star's CEO, would be at the head of the table. She'd have to present every number, every clause, every safeguard, and she'd need her rest. That was why she paid for this seat. Not for the champagne, not for the prestige, but for the certainty of a night without disruptions. Through the cabin wall, she heard the faint click of heels approaching. Someone stopped just outside her pod. She glanced up. The brunette flight attendant stood there, hands clasped in front of her, smile polite but a touch forced. "Good evening," she said. "I'm Kara Bishop. I'm one of the attendants in the forward cabin tonight." She leaned slightly closer, lowering her voice. "We have an operational seating need this evening, and I was wondering if you might be willing to relocate to another seat so we can accommodate another guest." Amani blinked, then tilted her head slightly. "I'm comfortable here. Thank you." Kara's smile didn't falter, but something in her eyes hardened just a fraction. It would only be a small change. "You'd still be in business class, of course." "I appreciate that," Amani said evenly, "but I selected this seat for a reason. I'd like to stay here." Kara gave a tiny nod, lips pressing into a line that could have been agreement or the opposite. "All right," she said, stepping back. "I'll check on something." As Kara moved toward the galley, Amani let out a slow breath. She'd learned long ago to trust her instincts. This wasn't over. She looked back at the window. The marshalers' batons were waving now, guiding the aircraft from its stand. The engine's growl deepened, vibrating through the floor. But, in her gut, the stillness she'd hoped for had already been disturbed. This was going to be a long flight. The plane had just begun its slow crawl toward the runway when Kara returned to the galley. She leaned into a small huddle with another crew member. Her voice pitched low but not low enough to escape the ears of row 2. Amani kept her gaze on her tablet, pretending to read, but her ears sharpened to the cadence of the conversation. There was a pause, a soft laugh from the other attendant, and then footsteps retreating down the aisle. From behind her came that same young man's voice. Louder now, self-assured. "Yeah, they're sorting it. They know I can't be in row 4. Bad angle for the vlog." He said it like it was the most reasonable thing in the world, like the purpose of this flight was to give him the perfect backdrop for his followers. Amani's eyes flicked to her reflection in the dark window. Her expression was calm, neutral, the mask she had worn for decades in boardrooms where assumptions were made before she even spoke. Inside, though, a faint irritation was taking shape. It wasn't about him. It wasn't even about the seat. It was about the pattern she had seen replayed in countless forms. Someone with noise and presence making a demand, and the quiet one being marked as the easiest to move. Kara reappeared, moving briskly toward row 2 with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Hi again," she said, stopping just short of Amani's pod. "I understand you'd prefer to keep your seat, but we do have a situation where a passenger in another row needs to be moved forward. It's part of our service accommodations, and we'd really appreciate your cooperation." Amani looked up, meeting her gaze without any hint of aggression. "And what is the nature of this need?" she asked. Kara hesitated for a beat. "It's a guest with special promotional status. It's important for him to be seated closer to the front for operational reasons." "Operational reasons," Amani repeated, her tone even. "Not a safety requirement, not a disability accommodation. Promotional status." Kara's posture stiffened. "It's part of our brand partnership commitments." "I understand," Amani said. "But I made a choice to purchase this seat for my own operational needs. Those needs include preparing for a meeting tomorrow morning that has been scheduled for months. I will be keeping my seat." The refusal was calm, deliberate, and absolute. Kara's eyes narrowed just slightly before she forced a pleasant nod. "I'll have to check with my purser," she said. "Please, hold tight." She turned sharply and walked toward the forward galley again. Amani took a slow sip from her water bottle, letting the cool liquid anchor her in place. She could feel the first threads of confrontation weaving themselves into the air. The man in row 4 was still talking. "She's being difficult. That's weird. I mean, who cares about the seat? Right? It's all the same service." His voice carried the false lightness of someone used to get in their way and surprised when the universe dared to resist. From the corner of her eye, Amani saw a man in the aisle seat across from her glance up from his book. He was older, silver-haired, with a calmness in his face that suggested a life spent listening more than speaking. His gaze lingered on her for a moment, not in pity, but in quiet assessment. Then he returned to his reading. The intercom clicked on briefly with a weather update from the cockpit. Smooth flight expected, arrival on time, the usual prelude to settling in. But Amani knew the matter wasn't closed. It took less than 5 minutes for Kara to return, this time with another figure in tow, the purser, no doubt, a tall woman with cropped blonde hair, a measured stride, and the kind of authority that came from years of running a cabin. Her uniform was immaculate, every line crisp. "Good evening," the purser said, introducing herself as Patricia Vale. Her voice was polite, but carried a weight behind it. "I understand there's been a request regarding your seat. We do have the discretion to reassign passengers when necessary, and, in this case, we are asking for your cooperation to move to another seat in the cabin." Amani kept her voice low, controlled. "Ms. Vale, I purchased this seat weeks ago. I selected it for specific reasons. I'm not inclined to move unless there is a genuine safety or accessibility need." Patricia's eyes held steady. "I'm afraid we can't disclose details about other passengers' needs. What I can tell you is that we require you to move. If you decline, we may need to ask you to deplane so we can resolve the seating arrangement before departure." The words landed with a thud between them. They weren't shouted, but they carried the unmistakable tone of a threat. A murmur rippled through the nearest rows. The man across the aisle, the silver-haired reader, closed his book and placed it in the seat pocket. He was paying full attention now. Amani's mind was calm, but beneath the surface, she felt the familiar split between the professional instinct to diffuse and the personal need to stand firm. This wasn't a negotiation she had sought, but it was one she recognized. And like every negotiation, it came down to leverage. She folded her hands in her lap. "Ms. Vale, if you're telling me that remaining in my purchased seat will result in my removal from the aircraft, then I'd like you to put that in writing for me, please. Include the reason, the policy citation, and your full name." Patricia blinked once, then leaned slightly closer. "That won't be necessary. I'm giving you a verbal directive. I'll need it in writing," Amani said, still calm. "For my own records." Kara shifted uncomfortably beside Patricia, her earlier confidence showing cracks. Patricia's jaw tightened. "I'll return in a moment," she said, turning sharply toward the galley. As they walked away, the man across the aisle spoke for the first time, his voice low enough to stay between them. "Stand your ground," he said. "They're testing if you'll fold." Amani gave him a small nod of thanks. She didn't know him, but she recognized the quiet solidarity in his tone. She returned her gaze to the window, the city lights shrinking below as the plane began its turn toward the runway. But she knew they weren't done. Far from it. Inside, she weighed her options. She could call it a matter of principle and refuse outright until they either backed down or removed her. Or she could reveal just enough of her position to shift the power dynamic without escalating into spectacle. The decision would have to be made soon, and once made, there would be no retreat. The captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing takeoff in just a few minutes. But Amani knew her real takeoff, the moment the flight's trajectory would truly change, was still ahead. The engines surged as the aircraft rolled forward, a steady vibration beneath the soles of her shoes. The safety video played on the small screen at her seat, but Amani barely registered the moving graphics. Her focus was on the two figures returning from the galley. Patricia walked in front, her posture precise, a small folder in her hand. Kara followed, a half-step behind, eyes fixed forward. Patricia stopped at 2A and looked down at Amani with the kind of practiced courtesy that held no warmth. "Dr. Rhodes," she said, glancing briefly at the manifest in her folder. "I have confirmed your name and seat assignment. I'm still requesting that you move to accommodate another passenger. If you decline, I will need to escalate this." Amani tilted her head slightly, her voice quiet but steady. "And what exactly does escalation entail? It means the captain will be informed, and if necessary, you may be asked to disembark." Patricia replied. Her tone was clipped now, the polished edge of service stripped away. The words hung in the air like frost. A few rows back, someone stopped mid-sentence. The hum of idle conversation faded to a low murmur. The man across the aisle, the one with the silver hair, folded his hands and watched without blinking. Amani felt a familiar split inside her. One part of her wanted to end it quickly, to give up the seat and let the hours pass in peace. But the deeper, older part knew this wasn't just about tonight. It was about every boardroom where she'd been underestimated, every negotiation where her silence had been mistaken for weakness. And, more than that, it was about the meeting tomorrow, the deal that could change the trajectory of the very airline trying to move her now. She looked up at Patricia, meeting her gaze without flinching. "I will not be moving from this seat," she said. "If you believe that requires removal, then you will need to document your reason in writing. I will wait for that." Patricia's mouth tightened. She glanced at Kara, who shifted her weight from one foot to the other, clearly uncomfortable. Then Patricia leaned in just enough to lower her voice. "You understand that making this difficult will have consequences?" Amani's reply was calm, almost gentle. "I understand that fairness sometimes requires difficulty." There was a pause. Then Patricia straightened and stepped back. "Very well," she said. "I'll speak with the captain." Kara lingered a second longer, her eyes searching Amani's face as if trying to measure whether she'd made a mistake. Then she followed Patricia toward the front of the cabin. Amani sat still, feeling the quiet weight of the moment settle over her. The silver-haired man leaned slightly toward the aisle. "They're not used to people asking for documentation," he said softly. "I'm not used to people threatening to take my seat without cause," she replied, her lips curving in a small, restrained smile. He chuckled under his breath, then returned to his seat. The hum of the engines deepened as the plane began its turn toward the runway. The safety video ended, replaced by a map showing their route across the Atlantic. 6 hours and 52 minutes to London. Her tablet still rested on the armrest, open to the Project Aegis briefing. She looked at it but didn't read. Instead, her mind drifted to tomorrow's meeting. She pictured the long oak table in the London office. Lionel Hart at the head, flanked by his finance chief and legal counsel. She imagined the quiet satisfaction of laying out the terms. The moment when the room understood that Helios Meridian Partners wasn't just another investor, it was the only investor willing to take on North Star Atlantic's failing cargo division. And now, here she was, in the middle of a petty power play on one of the airline's own flights. She wondered what Lionel would say if he knew. The purser's return came just before the cabin crew began their final checks for takeoff. Patricia stopped at the entrance to the galley, speaking briefly into the interphone. Kara stood beside her, arms crossed loosely, looking out over the cabin with an expression that was difficult to read. After a moment, Patricia replaced the handset and moved down the aisle, but not toward Amani. She stopped instead at row 4. From her seat, Amani could see the top of the young man's head as he leaned back, listening to Patricia speak. He gestured once, then twice, palms up as if to say, "Can't you fix this?" Patricia's tone was firm, her gestures controlled, but Amani caught one phrase as Patricia shifted her stance. "We're still working on it," as if her seat were a problem to be solved. Kara drifted back down the aisle and stopped beside 2A once more. "Ms. Rhodes," she said, her voice softer now. "I just want to assure you we're trying to handle this smoothly. The passenger in question, he's very insistent." Amani nodded once. "I understand. And I'm also insistent. For a moment." Kara's lips twitched in something like a smile, quickly smoothed away. "All right," she said. "We'll update you." She moved away again, leaving Amani alone with the quiet pulse of the engines and the steady beat of her own thoughts. The man in row 4 started talking again, his voice louder than necessary. "Some people just don't get it. I mean, it's not like she's famous or something." A ripple of uneasy laughter came from somewhere behind him. The silver-haired man across from Amani shifted in his seat, his jaw tightening. Amani took another sip of water. She felt the pressure building, but she also felt her center holding. Years of navigating tension had taught her one thing: if you could keep your voice calm while others raise theirs, you'd already won half the battle. The captain's voice came over the intercom, crisp and warm. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've been cleared for takeoff. Cabin crew, please be seated." Patricia and Kara both took their jump seats at the front, facing the cabin. The nose of the aircraft dipped slightly as the engines roared to full power. The runway lights streaked past in quick flashes. The vibration underfoot turned into a steady climb. Amani leaned back in her seat, letting the G-force press her into the cushion. She closed her eyes briefly, not to shut out the situation, but to anchor herself in it. This was no longer just about comfort. It was about dignity, and perhaps, though she wasn't ready to admit it yet, it was about setting a precedent for what would happen in London tomorrow. As the aircraft leveled off and the seatbelt sign remained lit, Amani opened her eyes. Outside the window, the last traces of the New Jersey coastline slipped into darkness. The cabin lights softened. The hum of conversation began to return. But the matter was far from closed. She could feel it in the way Patricia avoided her gaze as she passed to check on other passengers. In the way Kara glanced over from the galley, her brow furrowed ever so slightly, and in the way the man in row 4 kept casting glances toward the front, as if waiting for someone to deliver his prize. Amani rested her hands on the black leather portfolio beside her. If they pressed the issue again, she would decide in that moment whether to reveal what was inside. For now, she would wait. Sometimes the most strategic move was to let the other side believe they still had the advantage. She smiled faintly to herself. They had no idea. The seatbelt sign was still on when Patricia appeared again. Her expression was tight, as though she'd been rehearsing her next line in the forward galley. She had a small, laminated card in one hand and a folded sheet of paper in the other. Kara trailed behind, her arms crossed loosely, eyes flicking toward Amani, then away. Patricia stopped at 2A. "Dr. Rhodes," she began, her voice level. "I have spoken with the captain. I'm issuing a formal crew directive. This is an instruction from the flight's operating crew that you are required to follow. The directive is that you relocate from seat 2A to seat 4D. The words were measured, deliberate. Around them, passengers shifted in their seats. The murmur of conversation quieted again. Amani felt the weight of several pairs of eyes on her. She took a slow breath. "And if I decline to follow this directive," Patricia's jaw tightened. "Refusal to comply may result in removal from the flight, as well as possible consequences under federal aviation regulations." Amani let her gaze rest on Patricia's for a long moment. The silence stretched. In that pause, she weighed the cost. She thought about the early morning meeting in London. She thought about the months of negotiation leading to Project Aegis. And she thought about the quiet satisfaction on Zane Calder's face if he got what he wanted, Her voice, when it came, was calm. "I will need the reason for this directive in writing. Specifically, the operational or safety justification. That's not something we're required to provide in writing," Patricia said. Her tone was still polite, but the undercurrent had shifted from customer service to procedural authority. "Then I'm not required to comply," Amani replied. Kara shifted beside Patricia, glancing toward the cockpit door as if considering whether to retreat again. Patricia's eyes narrowed slightly. "You're making this more complicated than it needs to be." Amani's lips curved in a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Sometimes complication is the only path to clarity." Patricia inhaled, the sound sharp in the air. Then she straightened, looking over her shoulder toward the galley. "I'll inform the captain that you've refused." As the two women stepped away, Amani felt her pulse steady. She didn't relish confrontation, but neither would she surrender ground without cause. The silver-haired man across the aisle leaned slightly forward. "They're playing chicken," he murmured. Amani's eyes softened, "and they expect me to blink first." The hum of the engines filled the cabin as the plane leveled off into cruise. The seatbelt sign switched off with a soft chime. A few passengers rose to retrieve items from the overhead bins, moving cautiously around the silent tension between rows 2 and 4. Minutes later, Kara returned alone. She crouched slightly by Amani's seat, her voice lower now, stripped of the formal tone. "I want you to understand something. He's not just any passenger. He's got to deal with the airline, photos, videos, sponsorship. It's in his contract to be in the forward section." Amani turned her head toward her. "And does that contract supersede the rights of a paying customer?" Kara hesitated. "I'm not saying it should. I'm saying that's why this is happening." Amani studied her for a moment, then spoke softly. "Do you think this is right?" Kara's eyes flickered, just for a second, and in that flicker Amani saw the crack, the doubt. Kara stood abruptly, smoothing her uniform. "I'll check back," she said, retreating toward the galley. In row 4, Zane Calder was watching. He held his phone in one hand, the camera lens angled subtly toward the front. Amani caught the faint smirk on his lips before he turned back to his screen. She reached into her bag and removed the black leather portfolio. She didn't open it yet. Instead, she placed it on her lap, her fingers resting lightly on the cover. The weight of it was familiar, grounding. Inside were documents that could alter the airline's future. Documents that could, if revealed here and now, change the power dynamic in seconds. But revealing them now would mean losing the element of timing. And timing was everything. She closed her eyes for a moment, listening to the layered sounds of the cabin, the clink of glasses from the galley, the low thrum of the engines, the occasional cough or rustle of paper. Beneath it all was the taut string of anticipation, stretched between her and the crew. When she opened her eyes, Patricia was approaching again, this time with a different expression, less certain, more measured. She stopped at 2A, hands clasped in front of her. "The captain has asked to speak with you," Patricia said. "Would you be willing to step to the galley?" Amani regarded her for a moment, then nodded once. "Of course." She rose smoothly, tucking the portfolio under her arm, and followed Patricia toward the forward galley. Kara was already there, standing slightly to one side. The captain stood in the doorway to the cockpit, a tall man in his late 50s with a calm, weathered face. "Dr. Rhodes," he said, extending a hand. His voice was steady, almost warm. "I'm Captain Harlan Reed. I understand there's a disagreement about seating." Amani shook his hand. "That's one way to describe it. I'm hoping we can resolve it without further disruption," Reed said. "The passenger in 4D has made a request to be moved forward for brand partnership obligations. Normally, we'd honor that by moving another passenger. In this case, you, and I have declined," Amani said evenly. Reed studied her for a moment. "I'm not here to force you, but I need to understand if there's a reason you specifically chose that seat. Is it a matter of comfort, medical need, or something else?" Amani's gaze was steady. "It's a matter of preparation. I have work to do on this flight that requires the space and layout of this seat. I selected it weeks ago for that reason. I also believe that paid passengers should not be displaced for promotional convenience." Reed nodded slowly. "I see." There was a pause. Patricia shifted slightly behind him. Kara stood very still. Amani considered him for a moment, then added, "Captain, if I may, there is another layer here, one that might be relevant to your airline's long-term interests." Reed's brow furrowed slightly, but his tone remained neutral. "Go on." She didn't open the portfolio. "Not yet. Tomorrow morning, in London, I'm meeting with your CEO and board to finalize a strategic investment. An investment that could determine the future of your cargo operations. If you think I'm moving seats for a social media photo, you're misjudging both me and the stakes of this flight." The silence that followed was thick enough to slow the air. Reed's eyes held hers for a long moment. Then he inclined his head slightly. "Understood," he said. "You'll remain in your seat." Patricia's mouth opened, then closed. Kara's eyes flickered in quiet relief. Reed extended his hand again. "Thank you for explaining. Dr. Rhodes." She shook it, then returned to her seat without a backward glance. As she sat down, she caught the silver-haired man's approving nod. In row 4, Zane Calder's smirk had faded. The battle wasn't over, but the field had shifted. The soft chime of the seatbelt sign faded, but the tension in the forward cabin was still thick. Amani had barely reopened her tablet when she heard the sharp click of a phone camera shutter, followed by the faint electronic trill of a live stream starting. Zane Calder was sitting straighter in his seat in row 4, angled slightly toward the aisle. His phone was held at arm's length, the front-facing camera capturing his face and a slice of the cabin behind him. "Hey guys," he began, his voice just loud enough to carry forward. "So here we are, on North Star Atlantic Flight 318, and I'm having, let's call it, an interesting experience." His tone was light, performative, but the edge beneath it was unmistakable. A few heads turned. The silver-haired man across from Amani leaned slightly in her direction, his mouth tightening. Patricia was in the galley, her back to the scene, pretending to check service notes. Kara glanced over her shoulder, her brow furrowing. Zane continued. "I was supposed to be in the forward section. Contract says I'm up here for the brand partnership, but some people just don't care about agreements. They think they can just take up space meant for others." The word "others" hung in the air, sharp enough to slice. He didn't name her, but his camera angle made it obvious exactly who he was talking about. Amani could feel the heat of his gaze even though he never turned toward her. Her instinct was to ignore him, to give him nothing to feed on. But she knew how this worked. The clip would hit his followers within minutes, maybe seconds. By the time they landed, It could already be circulating in the kind of online echo chambers where narratives hardened before facts could catch up. The live stream chat feed scrolled fast on his screen. She caught flashes of comments. Some were sympathetic to him, some were curious, and a few, from usernames she didn't recognize, were already making assumptions about her. Her pulse thudded once, then steadied. She shifted her focus to the man himself. Zane's voice had taken on a mock-reasonable tone. "I'm not here to start drama," he said, smiling into the lens, "but you know me, I stand up for what's right. And right now, it's about honoring agreements and respecting the people who keep this airline in business." In the row behind him, a woman in a navy sweater leaned toward her travel companion. "Who is he?" she whispered. The other woman shrugged. "Some influencer, I think." Patricia emerged from the galley, her expression alert now. She approached Zane and lowered her voice, but he kept the phone pointed toward her. "We're live. Patricia," he said cheerfully, "say hi to the followers. I'm asking you to keep filming to a minimum in the cabin." Patricia replied, her voice carefully neutral. "Sure thing," Zane said, then turned the camera back to himself without lowering it. "See, crew's doing their best, but some people—" His eyes flicked past the camera toward Amani, just for a fraction of a second. "Some people make it harder than it needs to be." Amani's fingers rested on the portfolio in her lap. The urge to open it and end this, right here, was strong. But ending it now would mean acting on his timeline, not hers. She drew in a slow breath, feeling the cool air of the cabin on the back of her throat. Arthur Kim's voice came softly from across the aisle. "He's baiting you," he said. "Don't give him the clip he wants." She nodded faintly. "I know." Zane wrapped up his segment with a promise to update everyone later and ended the stream. But the air he left behind felt heavier. A few passengers were looking at Amani now with open curiosity. Others avoided her eyes altogether. Kara came down the aisle with the drink cart. When she reached 2A, she paused. "Can I get you something?" she asked, quietly. "Water, please," Amani said. As Kara poured it, she leaned slightly closer. "For what it's worth, some of us see what's happening. Just be careful." He knows how to play an audience. Amani gave her a small nod. "So do I." The next 20 minutes were a study in controlled theater. Zane alternated between scrolling on his phone and leaning into whispered conversations with a couple seated beside him. They laughed at intervals, the sound just loud enough to drift forward. Patricia kept busy with service, her movements crisp, avoiding eye contact with both Zane and Amani. At one point, a man from row 6 came forward to use the lavatory and, on his way back, paused near 2A. "Is everything all right here?" he asked in a low voice. Amani looked up at him, reading the concern in his expression. "Everything is fine," she said, her tone steady. "Enjoy your flight?" He hesitated, then nodded and returned to his seat. But his glance back toward row 4 was unmistakable. The quiet solidarity mattered more than she expected. It reminded her that while voices like Zane's could be loud, they weren't the only ones in the room. She turned her attention to her tablet, forcing herself to focus on the Project Aegis documents. The numbers were familiar, the language precise, but her mind kept circling back to the social dynamics unfolding in the cabin. This wasn't just about a seat anymore. It was about how quickly perception could be shaped in a confined space, and how true leadership revealed itself under pressure. The hum of the engines was constant. almost soothing. Outside the window, night stretched unbroken, the Atlantic invisible beneath the darkness. Inside, the forward cabin had settled into a tense equilibrium. Then Zane shifted again. He picked up his phone, scrolled briefly, and began typing. Amani caught enough of the screen to see her seat number mentioned in a post-draft. Her jaw tightened. She looked away, choosing not to track every keystroke. Patricia appeared again, this time stopping by Amani's seat. "Dr. Rhodes, we'll be starting dinner service shortly. Would you like the beef tenderloin or the vegetable risotto?" "The risotto, please," Amani said. Patricia wrote it down without comment, but as she turned to go, she hesitated. "For the record, I appreciate that you've kept your composure," she said. Her voice pitched low. Amani studied her. "That sounds like you've seen others lose it in this situation." Patricia's eyes flickered. Then she moved away without answering. Dinner service unfolded with quiet efficiency. The risotto was fragrant with herbs, steam curling into the cool cabin air. Amani ate slowly, savoring each bite not for the flavor, but for the grounding sensation of a deliberate act. It was a small claim of normalcy in an environment tilted toward disruption. Across the aisle, Arthur ate in silence, occasionally glancing toward her. When the plates were cleared, the cabin lights dimmed slightly for rest. Zane leaned back, his voice low but still audible. "We'll see who's smiling when we land," he said to no one in particular. Amani closed her eyes briefly, letting the words slide past. She pictured the London boardroom again, the polished surface of the table, the quiet attention of decision-makers. She thought about the moment she would present the final terms, the way the air would shift when they realized she had navigated not just market volatility and corporate politics, but also the petty theater of a single transatlantic flight. Her eyes opened to the soft glow of the overhead reading light. She reached for her notebook and pen, writing a single line in the margin of her meeting agenda. "Power does not always speak first, but it will speak last." She closed the notebook, placed it on top of the portfolio, and settled back in her seat. Whatever came next, she was ready. The cabin was quiet enough that the soft clink of ice in a glass carried forward from the galley. Dinner service had ended, trays cleared, and most passengers had reclined into the rhythm of a long-haul night. But in row 4, Zane Calder was still restless. He leaned toward the couple beside him, murmuring in a tone meant to carry without sounding overt. The man nodded sympathetically. The woman glanced toward the front, her eyes pausing on Amani before she looked away. Zane's voice rose slightly, enough for the next row to hear. "It's about principle. If you pay for a product, you should get it, not have someone take your place." The phrase "your place" was deliberate, weighted. Amani felt it ripple through the air. 2 rows back, someone coughed into their hand and shifted in their seat. It was the kind of subtle body language that told her Zane's words were taking root with some. Arthur Kim caught her eye across the aisle. His gaze was steady, the message silent but clear hold. Zane stood, stretching, then took a slow walk up the aisle as though he were just loosening his legs. He stopped beside Arthur's seat. "Hey, you've seen what's happening here, right?" His tone was genial, but his eyes were sharp. "You think that's fair?" Arthur looked up at him with measured calm. "I think you should sit down and let the crew do their jobs." Zane's smile tightened. Noted, he moved on, stopping briefly beside the navy-sweatered woman in row 3. A short exchange, a quiet laugh from her companion. Zane was sowing seeds, one row at a time. Amani shifted in her seat, feeling the familiar pull of a choice. She could continue to absorb the pressure, waiting him out until London, or she could take control of the narrative here, before it solidified in the small ecosystem of the forward cabin. She reached for the black leather portfolio and set it on the tray table. Her fingers tapped once against the cover, then stilled. Timing was still everything, but perhaps there was a way to show her hand just enough to change the current without draining her advantage. When Zane returned to his seat, he paused beside her row, leaning a fraction into the aisle. "Hope you're comfortable," he said lightly. She looked up at him. "Very, and you?" His smile was practiced. "I manage." Her gaze held his for one beat longer than was comfortable. Then she flipped the portfolio open, slow enough that his eyes followed the motion. Inside, neatly secured under leather straps, was a crisp document folder embossed with the Helios Meridian Partners crest. Beneath it, partially visible, was the cover page of a report titled Strategic Integration Proposal Project Aegis North Star Atlantic Cargo Division. The title was deliberate in its clarity. Zane's eyes narrowed just slightly. "Business trip?" he asked. She closed the portfolio again, just as slowly. "Something like that." Arthur shifted in his seat, sensing the subtle shift in energy. Zane lingered a moment longer, then moved back to his own seat, but his phone stayed in his hand. Minutes later, Kara appeared with a pot of coffee. She poured for Arthur, then for Amani, leaning just enough to speak quietly. "He's losing a bit of steam," she murmured. That little display with the folder, it got his attention. "That was the point," Amani said. Kara's lips twitched in the smallest of smiles before she moved on. The next ripple came when the man from row 6, the same one who'd asked earlier if she was all right, stood and walked forward. He stopped beside her row, his voice pitched so only she could hear. "I don't know what this is about, but you're handling it better than most would. For what it's worth, I think you're in the right." Amani inclined her head. "Thank you." He nodded once and returned to his seat. The exchange was brief, but Zane saw it. His jaw tightened. Patricia emerged from the galley with a tray of water glasses for the crew rest area. As she passed Amani's seat, she spoke under her breath. "Whatever you're doing, keep doing it." It was a rare alignment, passengers quietly siding with her. Crew beginning to lean away from the influencer's gravity. The balance was shifting, molecule by molecule, but Zane wasn't done. An hour into the flight, with cabin lights dimmed for rest, he rose again. This time he addressed the front section more openly. "I just think we should all get what we pay for," he said, voice carrying, "and if someone's in the wrong seat, it's not fair to the rest of us." The words hung there, unanswered, until Arthur's voice cut through the dark. "And I think we should mind our own business unless we know the whole story." There was a pause, then a quiet laugh from somewhere in row 3. It wasn't mocking, it was more a release of tension. Zane glanced around, realized he didn't have as much support as he'd thought, and returned to his seat. Amani watched him settle back, his shoulders stiffer now. She could almost hear the mental gears turning, recalculating. She knew he was already editing in his head, deciding how this would play on his next stream, how he could spin partial victory from the frayed edges of a failed cabin coup. She let her eyes drift to the window. Outside, The moonlight cut a silver path across the invisible water. She thought of the London boardroom again, of the moment the CEO would shake her hand and know, even without the details, that she'd carried herself with the kind of composure money couldn't buy. Her thoughts were interrupted by Kara's quiet return. "We'll be serving breakfast about 90 minutes before landing," she said. "Do you want me to hold yours if you're asleep?" "That would be appreciated," Amani replied. Kara hesitated, then added, "You've made an impression on some of the crew, just so you know." Amani's brow lifted. Good or bad, Kara smiled faintly, the kind that lasts. As Kara moved away, Amani leaned back in her seat, closing her eyes for a moment. The portfolio rested on the tray table still closed, its contents untouched. She imagined the faces in the boardroom, the nods of understanding when she recounted carefully, without names, how one flight had become a crucible for judgment, perception, and the subtle art of holding ground. The cabin settled again. Zane was quiet now, scrolling on his phone without speaking. Arthur had turned on his reading light, the glow catching in his silver hair. The hum of the engines was steady, a heartbeat beneath the silence. Amani opened her eyes and reached for her notebook once more. She wrote a single phrase under the line she'd jotted earlier. "Control is not taken. It is kept." The ink was still drying when she closed the notebook and placed it back atop the portfolio. She could feel the eyes of the cabin still on her, but now the gaze was different, less probing, more curious. It was the look people gave when they sensed something unspoken, something larger than the visible exchange, and that was fine. Some truths were better revealed at the right moment, to the right audience. When they landed in London, that moment would come. For now, she let the engines carry them forward into the night. The cabin lights were dimmed to a soft amber glow, but there was nothing sleepy about the atmosphere in the forward section. Zane Calder was hunched over his phone again, the faint blue light from his screen casting sharp angles across his face. His thumbs moved fast, the kind of practice speed that came from years of feeding an audience in real time. Amani could tell he was no longer just posting idle thoughts. His posture had shifted from casual to intent. She could almost feel the ripple before it reached her. The quiet chime of a notification echoed faintly from somewhere in the crew rest area, followed by the soft thud of hurried footsteps in the galley. Patricia emerged moments later, phone in hand. She didn't look at Amani at first. Her eyes were fixed on Zane. When she reached him, she bent slightly and spoke in a low voice. He smiled without looking up, nodded once, then went right back to typing. Whatever she had said, it clearly wasn't going to stop him. Arthur Kim leaned toward Amani. "Something tells me our friend just lit a fire online." Amani's lips curved slightly, and the oxygen is plentiful. From the galley. Kara returned carrying a water bottle for the passenger in 3C, but her eyes caught Amani's. She paused for half a second, a subtle signal that something was brewing. The signal became fact when Patricia's voice came over the interphone, low but urgent, calling the cockpit. A minute later, the purser reappeared, her expression tighter than before. She stopped by Amani's seat. "Dr. Rhodes," she began quietly, "this is just to keep you in the loop. Mr. Calder has posted a series of updates tagging the airline directly. His posts are gathering attention." How much attention, Amani asked. Patricia hesitated. "Enough that our corporate communications team just contacted the flight deck." Amani took a sip of her coffee. "I see. She didn't have to ask for details. She knew exactly how this worked. Someone with Zane's following could stir a storm in minutes. The airline's social media team would already be scrambling to draft holding statements, scanning passenger manifests, and weighing whether to reach out mid-flight. The irony was that the more they reacted, the more leverage Zane would believe he had. But leverage was a tricky thing. It could look like power right up until the moment it collapsed under its own weight. Across the aisle, Arthur spoke quietly. He is playing to a crowd that can't see the whole picture. That's the only crowd he knows how to play to. Amani replied, "In row 4. Zane adjusted his seat, angled his phone toward the aisle, and hit record again. This time he didn't bother lowering his voice. "So, here's where we are," he began, his tone a blend of frustration and showmanship. "Halfway over the Atlantic, and the airline has decided that contracts don't matter. I've been told to sit tight while someone else enjoys the seat I was supposed to have. And when I try to share that with you all, they want me to be quiet. Imagine that." 2 passengers in row 3 turned to glance at Amani, then back at Zane. The story was being shaped in real time, and she was the silent figure at its center. She reached for her portfolio, placed it on the tray table, and opened it again. This time, she didn't just flash the cover. She pulled out the top document and set it squarely where anyone passing could read the heading. "Strategic Integration Proposal Project, Aegis Confidential. Prepared for North Star Atlantic Cargo Division." It was bait, but also a line in the sand. The few passengers who noticed gave it longer glances than before. Arthur's eyes narrowed in approval. Patricia, passing with the beverage cart, caught sight of the document and stopped briefly. "That's quite specific," she murmured. Amani met her gaze evenly. Sometimes clarity's helpful. 15 minutes later, the interphone chimed again. This time, Patricia came directly to Amani. "The captain has asked if you'd be willing to have a brief conversation once we reach cruise stability. Corporate is requesting context." "Of course," Amani said. "I will be glad to speak with them." The purser nodded, her expression shifting just slightly as though she had just confirmed something to herself. Meanwhile, Zane was doubling down. His latest post flashed on the phone of the man in 3A, who showed it to his seatmate with a raised eyebrow. The headline was inflammatory, the kind designed to rack up engagement fast. It mentioned her seat number again, tagged the airline twice, and hinted at preferential treatment without naming her outright. The words preferential treatment landed differently for different ears. For some, it was about money, for others, about race, and for many, it was just the kind of ambiguity that kept them watching. Arthur broke the silence. "Do you plan to correct the record when the record matters to the right people?" Amani said. Outside the window, the Atlantic stretched unbroken, moonlight painting the clouds in silver. The steady hum of the engine seemed almost at odds with the undercurrent of human drama playing out in a space barely 30 feet long. It was another half hour before Patricia returned, motioning for Amani to follow her toward the galley. Kara was there, leaning against the counter. In the small space, the hum of the engines was louder, more intimate. "The captain's on the line with corporate," Patricia said. "They would like to verify some details with you in case they need to prepare a statement before we land." Amani inclined her head. "Then let's." The handset was cool in her palm. On the other end, a composed voice introduced themselves as a senior representative from North Star Atlantic's Corporate Communications Department. They asked a series of calm, measured questions: her name, her company, the nature of her travel, her awareness of Mr. Calder's posts. When they finished, Amani spoke with quiet precision. "I am traveling on behalf of Helios Meridian Partners to finalize Project Aegis with your cargo division. My seat assignment was confirmed well before departure. I have not engaged Mr. Calder, though he has chosen to engage me publicly. I trust your team will decide how best to address that." There was a pause on the line, followed by a tone of recognition. "Understood, Dr. Rhodes. We will handle this." She returned to her seat with the same unhurried grace she had left it. Zane glanced up as she passed, searching her face for any sign of discomfort. He found none. The rest of the cabin seemed to sense a shift. The conversations quieted. The glances toward row 4 became less frequent. Even the couple Zane had charmed earlier seemed more interested in their in-flight movie than in his running commentary. Arthur's voice was low but certain. "That, I believe, was the beginning of the end." Amani allowed herself the faintest smile. Endings are about timing. She closed her portfolio, set it neatly on her lap, and looked out the window again. The night sky was vast, the journey far from over, but the balance of control had tilted. When the wheels touched down in London, the story would no longer belong to the man in row 4. It would belong to her. The engines droned a steady note as the flight pushed deeper into the night. Most of the cabin was in that liminal space between wakefulness and sleep, the air heavy with the scent of brewed coffee and faint traces of perfume. But Amani could feel the subtle restlessness in row 4. Zane Calder's leg bounced under his table, a restless staccato that betrayed his calm facade. He was watching her again, not openly, but in those brief glances when he thought she would not notice. Something in his posture told her he knew the balance had shifted. The crew was cooler toward him now, and even his earlier allies in the cabin had retreated into polite distance. He tapped his phone once more, lifting it just high enough to record himself in the dim light. "So here's the latest," he said quietly, but loud enough for the microphone. "Corporate wants to sweep this under the rug. They're protecting their own. We'll see if they're ready for the fallout when we land." Arthur Kim looked up from his book and caught Amani's gaze. "He is digging deeper. He thinks the hole is a stage," she replied. She could sense that he was crafting a final act for his audience. It was not enough for him to have stirred the air mid-flight. He needed an ending that could go viral, and for that, he would have to draw her into the spotlight. It came faster than she expected. 10 minutes later. Zane rose from his seat and moved down the aisle toward her, phone in hand. The recording light glowed faintly red. He stopped at her row, turned slightly so the camera would capture both their faces, and spoke with theatrical civility. "Dr. Rhodes, is it, since you seem comfortable in my seat? Perhaps you'd like to explain to my audience how that came about." The cabin stilled. Even the hum of the engine seemed to fade in that moment. Amani looked at him, then at the lens. Her voice was calm, steady. "This is not your seat, Mr. Calder. It is mine, and this is not the place for your performance." Zane's smile tightened. "So you won't answer? That's fine. I think the silence speaks volumes." Arthur's voice came from across the aisle, low but carrying. "What speaks volumes is using strangers for content they didn't consent to." A ripple of agreement moved through the rows. Someone in 3C murmured. Exactly. Zane hesitated. The moment was not landing the way he had planned. He pivoted, raising his voice just slightly. Ladies and gentlemen, I just want you to see how they treat paying customers. Amani reached for her portfolio, opened it, and, without breaking eye contact, lifted the top document so the heading was visible to both Zane and his camera. Strategic Integration Proposal Project, Aegis Confidential. You may want to end your recording now, she said evenly. Before you broadcast something your lawyers would rather you did not. There was a pause so sharp it seemed to cut the air. Zane's phone wavered slightly. His eyes flicked to the heading, then back to her face. For a moment, the performance mask slipped, replaced by calculation. He lowered the phone, but the damage was already done. A few passengers in nearby rows had caught the title of the document and exchanged looks. One leaned toward another, whispering, "That's the cargo deal, isn't it?" Patricia appeared at Zane's side like a shadow. "Mr. Calder, please return to your seat. I'm just documenting my experience," he said, but the bluster was thinner now. "And I am instructing you to sit down," Patricia replied, her tone edged with authority. Zane glanced around, searching for the easy sympathy that had come so readily earlier in the flight. It was not there. The couple he had charmed now looked away. The man in 3A was scrolling his tablet, uninterested. He returned to his seat, muttering something under his breath, but the camera stayed off this time. Amani closed the portfolio and rested her hands on top of it. Arthur tilted his head toward her. "Well played. It was just the truth," she said. From the galley, Kara emerged with a tray of tea service, moving quietly through the aisle. When she reached Amani, she set a cup in front of her and spoke softly. "You may have just ended his show." Amani smiled faintly. It was overdue. For the next hour, the cabin returned to a quieter rhythm. Some passengers slept, others watched movies or read. Zane kept to himself, though his shoulders remained tight, his attention darting between his phone and the slowly moving map on his screen. It was near the midpoint between their departure and London when Patricia returned, crouching slightly beside Amani's seat. "I thought you should know corporate called back. They've been monitoring the posts, and they're prepared to make a statement if necessary. They also express their appreciation for your discretion." Amani inclined her head. "Thank you for telling me." She understood the subtext. Corporate had likely checked her credentials by now, confirmed the scope of Project Aegis, and recognized the weight she carried for the airline's cargo division. This was no longer a passenger issue. It was a strategic one. The rest of the flight might still hold turbulence, but not of the kind that could threaten her position. An hour later, when Kara returned to check on her, Amani asked for a glass of sparkling water. She took it in hand, watching the bubbles rise to the surface, and allowed herself a long, steady breath. The battle had not been loud, but it had been decisive. And in the quiet that followed, she felt the satisfaction of having held her ground without compromising her composure. In row 4, Zane scrolled through his feed, the set of his mouth betraying what he found there. The engagement was still there, but the comments were shifting. More and more were questioning his account, pointing out the lack of clarity, asking for the other side of the story. His audience was fracturing in real time. He glanced toward her again, but this time there was no challenge in his eyes, only calculation, as if weighing whether to approach her with some private olive branch before they landed. She met his gaze briefly, then turned back to the window, signaling the conversation was over. The stars stretched endlessly above the dark Atlantic, and the engines carried them forward toward London. The stage he had tried to build had collapsed quietly, leaving only the hum of the aircraft and the quiet assurance that control was not something given, but something maintained. When the seatbelt sign lit for light turbulence, Amani fastened hers, folded her hands, and let her eyes close for the first real rest since takeoff. In the cabin's dim stillness, it was clear to anyone watching who truly held the upper hand now. The cabin had settled into the kind of hush that only long-haul night flights can hold. A few overhead reading lights glowed here and there, casting little pools of warm light on pages and screens. The engines maintained their constant, reassuring hum. But to Amani, the atmosphere felt poised for something. It was the stillness just before the balance tips. Patricia appeared in the aisle, moving with quiet purpose. She stopped beside Amani and leaned slightly closer. "The captain would like to speak to you for a moment. Corporate is on the SATCOM line again." Amani unbuckled her seatbelt, gathered her portfolio, and followed Patricia toward the forward galley. Kara was already there, holding the handset with both hands, her expression a mix of curiosity and respect. She handed it over. The voice on the other end was clear despite the faint static of the connection. "Dr. Rhodes, thank you for taking the time. I'm speaking on behalf of the North Star Atlantic executive team. We have been monitoring developments on board. We want to assure you that your seating and travel arrangements remain exactly as confirmed. We appreciate your professionalism throughout." Amani replied evenly, "I appreciate the confirmation. I hope the matter has not disrupted operations beyond this cabin." "It has been addressed," the voice said. "In fact, we have briefed the captain and purser to take necessary measures to ensure your comfort and privacy for the remainder of the flight." She could sense the layers beneath those words. This was not simply about comfort. This was about optics, about making clear to the crew that certain passengers could not be treated with anything less than care. It was also about sending a message to anyone watching the incident from afar that the airline understood exactly who they were dealing with. When she returned to her seat, Zane's eyes followed her. He was no longer pretending not to watch. There was a tension there now, not just in his posture, but in the way he seemed to measure her every movement. 5 minutes later, the captain's voice came over the PA, calm, professional, the kind of voice that could make any announcement sound routine. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We'd like to thank you for your cooperation tonight and assure you that all passengers are traveling under confirmed arrangements. Our priority is ensuring that each guest arrives comfortably and on time." It was a simple statement without naming anyone. But in the coded language of airline announcements, it was unmistakable. The captain had just anchored the authority of the seating arrangements, effectively closing the door on any public dispute. Arthur looked over his glasses at Amani and smiled. That was as direct as they can be without handing out name tags. "Exactly," she said. From row 4 came the faint sound of a phone being set down on a tray table. Zane was staring at the dark screen, scrolling slowly, as if hoping the feed would give him an opening that wasn't there anymore. The flight attendants resumed their service, and the mood of the cabin began to lighten. Passengers accepted drinks and snacks, some returning to conversations, others to their screens. Amani could feel the collective shift, the way people seemed ready to move past the incident. as though the authority of the captain's voice had cleared the air. But Zane was not finished. Not yet. His pride would not allow him to vanish into the quiet. He stood again, this time without his phone raised, and approached Patricia in the galley. Amani could not hear the words, but she saw the stiff set of Patricia's shoulders as she listened. When Zane gestured toward Amani's seat, Patricia's response was short and final. He returned to his row, his jaw tight. Arthur leaned closer and whispered, "He is beginning to realize the ground has shifted beneath him." "Once a story stops serving its author," Amani said softly, "it starts serving the truth." A subtle moment came when Kara, on her way past Zane's row, paused to adjust an overhead bin. She spoke just loud enough for the nearby passengers to hear. "We'll be arriving in London on time, and all confirmed seats will remain as assigned. Thank you for your understanding." It was a gentle echo of the captain's message, but it landed exactly where it needed to. The couple in row 3 smiled faintly, as if recognizing a quiet victory. The man in 3A glanced at Amani with a nod. For the next stretch of the flight, the tension continued to dissolve. Amani accepted another cup of coffee from Kara, savoring the warmth. Outside, the Atlantic was a vast black canvas, the stars scattered thickly across it. She let herself take in the steady rhythm of the journey, the knowledge that the most volatile part of the flight was no longer in the engines or the weather, but behind them. Zane, for his part, seemed restless. He scrolled, typed, deleted, scrolled again. Without the momentum of outrage and the sympathy of nearby passengers, his posts had begun to lose traction. Comments that once urged him on now questioned his version of events. Some even defended the airline, noting the captain's announcement. An hour before descent, Patricia returned to Amani's seat. "Just so you're aware, corporate has arranged for discreet assistance for you upon arrival. You'll be met at the gate and escorted through the arrival process." "That is considerate," Amani replied. She knew this was not just about courtesy. It was about making sure the story ended exactly where the airline wanted it to at the gate, with her walking off the aircraft in control and any loose threads left on the tarmac. Arthur looked out the window toward the faint line of dawn. "We'll be over Ireland soon," he said. Amani followed his gaze. A thin blush of light touched the horizon, the first suggestion of morning. The night's drama was nearly over, and with it, the arc of control had completed its slow, quiet turn. As the cabin prepared for descent, Zane made one last attempt. He approached Amani's row, standing in the aisle with an expression that hovered between forced charm and reluctant concession. "I suppose," he began, "we could both agree to just move on from this." Amani looked up at him, her tone even, "I already have." He stood there a beat longer, then returned to his seat. For the rest of the approach, he kept his gaze fixed on the seat back in front of him. When the wheels finally touched down on the runway at Gatwick, the cabin broke into soft applause, not for the incident, but for the journey's end. Amani joined in politely, her mind already shifting to the meeting ahead, to Project Aegis, to the work that had brought her here. The door opened, and a pair of uniformed ground agents stepped inside. One approached her seat with a quiet greeting. "Dr. Rhodes, we'll escort you through the terminal." She gathered her portfolio, thanked Arthur for his conversation, and stepped into the aisle. Behind her, the murmur of passengers collecting bags filled the cabin. She did not look back at row 4. As she stepped off the aircraft, the cool morning air met her face. It carried none of the tension from the night before, only the clarity of a new day. Whatever storm Zane had tried to stir had dissipated somewhere over the Atlantic, leaving her exactly where she intended to be ahead of schedule, in control, and entirely unshaken. The jet bridge smelled faintly of metal and cool morning air. Amani stepped into it with her portfolio secure under her arm, her stride calm and deliberate. Behind her, the murmurs of passengers eager to start their day mixed with the soft hiss of the aircraft systems winding down. The two uniformed ground agents moved at her sides, their presence neither imposing nor flashy, but unmistakably purposeful. As they emerged into the terminal, the light was different, softer than the harsh LEDs of the cabin, tinged with the pale gold of early London morning. She registered the shift instantly, the way the air seemed to open up around her, the scent of coffee from a nearby kiosk cutting through the sterile airport atmosphere. Then she saw them. Just beyond the security barrier, a cluster of people holding phones in that half-raised posture that is not quite filming, but ready to become so. Most were probably travelers with nothing to do while waiting for their own connections. But she recognized the practiced angle of one camera, the kind that suggests the operator is not here by chance. Patricia had warned her before deplaning that word had leaked. The airline had been careful, but a single post mid-flight from someone with Zane's following was enough to draw curiosity. Even if his version was losing steam online, the mere hint of an onboard dispute involving a well-known influencer was bait for the right audience. The ground agents adjusted their formation slightly, giving her a bit more space on either side. One of them, a tall woman with a clipped accent, leaned in just enough to say, straight through customs, "Dr. Rhodes, we have clearance for priority processing." Amani inclined her head in thanks and kept walking. The key now was not to appear hurried. Confidence was not just a feeling, it was choreography. Every step, every angle of her chin had to telegraph that she was here for reasons beyond any petty squabble. They moved toward the immigration counters, where a separate lane waited. She caught a glimpse over her shoulder. Zane had emerged from the jet bridge, pulling his carry-on, a camera still hanging from one wrist. He looked around as though searching for the same audience he'd hoped to command on the aircraft. But here the dynamic was different. Without the captive setting of the cabin, he was just another traveler among dozens spilling into the terminal. Amani passed through immigration in minutes. The officer glanced at her passport, tapped a few keys, and waved her through with a polite, "Welcome to the United Kingdom." The ground agents led her toward baggage claim, though she had only a single checked case. As they waited for the carousel to turn, one of them received a message on a discreet earpiece. "They are ready upstairs," he told her. She understood. Corporate had set up a private lounge meeting before her driver took her to the city. It would be the moment to debrief, align narratives, and ensure the airline's version of events was locked before any external story could gain traction. When her bag appeared, she retrieved it herself, an intentional choice. She did not want the optics of being handled as though she were too important for the ordinary motions of travel. Instead, she simply nodded to the agents and followed them through a service corridor toward an elevator marked "Staff Only." The lounge was hushed, its furnishings understated in cream and navy. A view of the tarmac spread beyond the floor-to-ceiling windows, where other flights taxied and lifted into the pale sky. A man in a tailored suit rose as she entered. "Dr. Rhodes." Thank you for agreeing to meet. I'm Daniel Harcourt, Director of International Operations for North Star Atlantic. They shook hands, his grip firm but not overbearing. He gestured to a small seating area where coffee and fruit had been laid out. I'll be brief. We are aware of the posts Mr. Calder made during the flight. We've taken measures to ensure they do not gain further traction. Our social media team has already seeded positive passenger accounts from the same flight, highlighting the professionalism of the crew and the uneventful nature of the journey. Amani listened without interruption. She knew this was part of the cleanup playbook flood the narrative with alternative versions before one can settle as fact. Harcourt continued, "Our priority is maintaining our relationship with Helios Meridian partners, particularly in light of Project Aegis. We want to assure you that the incident will not overshadow that partnership. I appreciate that," she said, "and I also appreciate the professionalism of certain members of your crew who de-escalated the situation." He nodded. "We have noted their actions and will ensure they are recognized. Conversely, any inappropriate behavior has been addressed internally." She understood the phrasing. Addressed internally meant disciplinary measures, perhaps even dismissals, but wrapped in the language of corporate discretion. From the window, she caught sight of Zane being stopped briefly by airport staff at a public exit. It was nothing formal, just a request to check something on his declaration, but it delayed him long enough for the small crowd to drift away. His opportunity to create an arrival scene narrative evaporated in those extra minutes. Harcourt followed her gaze. "We have also issued instructions to our ground staff to avoid facilitating any staged interactions upon arrival." "Prudent," she said. They spoke for another 15 minutes, aligning on key talking points should any media inquiry reach her directly. She agreed to provide no comment beyond confirming her satisfaction with the flight and the airline's handling of her travel. It was the cleanest way forward, no fuel for speculation, no public contradiction, just closure. When she finally left the lounge, the agents guided her to a private car waiting on the service road. London's morning traffic was already building, but inside the car, the world was quiet. She watched the city unfold through the tinted glass, the familiar blend of history and modernity passing in steady rhythm. She thought about the hours over the Atlantic, the pressure of staying composed under the eyes of both passengers and an opportunist with a camera. There had been moments when she could feel the temptation to snap, to respond with sharpness instead of calm, but she had resisted, and now the reward was clear. The airline was in her debt, the narrative was hers to shape, and Zane's power had faded into background noise. Her phone buzzed. A message from a colleague at Helios saw something online about a flight incident. "Just noise," she typed back, completely resolved. "All good here. See you at the office." The car slipped onto the Thames embankment, the river catching the light of a sun still low in the sky. The meeting for Project Aegis would begin in a few hours, and she intended to walk in without a trace of the night's turbulence on her face. By the time they reached her hotel, she felt the weight of the journey ease. She tipped the driver, stepped into the marble-floored lobby, and moved toward the elevators. Her reflection in the polished steel doors showed a woman composed, unshaken, and ready for what came next. Somewhere, Zane might still be posting, still trying to wring one last drop of engagement from the story. But here, on this side of the Atlantic, his relevance was already fading. The real work, the reason for her travel, was just beginning. The conference room at Helios Meridian Partners' London office sat high above the city, its glass walls offering a panorama of rooftops and the serpentine curve of the Thames. Morning sunlight spilled across the long, polished table, glinting off water glasses and stainless steel carafes. The room was already half full when Amani stepped through the door, and every head turned. Not in surprise, but with the kind of subtle acknowledgement reserved for someone whose reputation precedes them. She had taken the time to compose herself completely before arriving. A crisp charcoal suit, silk blouse in muted teal, hair smooth and pulled back, every detail deliberate, every thread sending the same message: I'm here to do business. Her London counterpart, Helena Voss, rose from her seat at the far end. Helena was tall, with sharp Scandinavian features and a voice that could cut through noise without ever sounding rushed. She crossed the room to greet Amani with both hands. "We have been hearing about your flight," she said, her tone pitched low. "It seems you handled the situation with remarkable poise." Amani smiled faintly. It was an uneventful journey in the ways that matter. Helena's eyes held a glimmer of amusement. "And yet, uneventful in your hands seems to mean something different than for most. Come, sit. We have much to cover." As they settled, Amani noted the presence of two North Star Atlantic executives at the far side of the table. It was not unusual for them to be in the room when a major partnership was on the table, but the timing was telling. This was not just about Project Aegis. This was also about optics, about demonstrating that the airline valued and respected the people behind their most critical deals. The meeting began with Helena outlining the agenda. They would review final terms, confirm capital allocations, and set a public launch timeline. But before diving into the numbers, Helena gestured toward one of the North Star executives, a man in his early 50s with a calm, deliberate demeanor. "This is Jonathan Pell, Senior VP for Strategic Partnerships," Helena said. "Jonathan wanted to make a few remarks before we begin." Pell inclined his head toward Amani. "I wanted to acknowledge that our company owes you thanks. We were made aware of a situation on Flight 318 that could have escalated unnecessarily. The fact that it did not, and that it concluded with dignity and tact, is in large part due to your restraint. That kind of professionalism does not go unnoticed, and it certainly factors into the trust we place in our partners." There was a murmur of assent around the table. Amani met Pell's gaze evenly. "I believe in keeping focus where it belongs. Distractions are a luxury high-value projects cannot afford." Helena tapped her pen against a notepad, her smile subtle but approving. "Precisely the mindset we need for the months ahead." The conversation turned to strategy. Amani walked them through her projections for the rollout of Project Aegis, illustrating how the alignment between Helios and North Star would allow for rapid penetration into key markets. Her voice was measured, her pacing deliberate, and even those who had heard her present before seemed to be leaning in a little closer. She could feel the undercurrent in the room, the quiet knowledge that this was a person who could navigate turbulence without spilling a drop. Halfway through, Helena called for a short break, as people stretched their legs and poured fresh coffee. One of the younger analysts approached Amani with a cautious expression. "I hope you don't mind me saying, but my sister works for North Star. She messaged me this morning saying that whatever people were saying online about that flight, the real story was very different." Amani lifted her cup. The truth tends to travel a quieter route. The analyst grinned. Still gets there, though. When the meeting resumed, the momentum felt even more solid. The terms were agreed upon with minimal adjustments, the timeline locked in, the press strategy outlined. By the time Helena declared the deal finalized, the mood in the room was a blend of satisfaction and anticipation. As they stood to shake hands, Pell stepped closer to Amani. "One more thing," he said in a low voice. "You should know that Mr. Calder's posts have been quietly deprioritized by multiple platforms. No official statement from us, of course, but certain relationships help when we need to prevent misinformation from becoming a headline." "I imagine that works both ways," she replied. He smiled slightly. "Indeed it does." By early afternoon, Amani was back in the hotel lobby, her mind already shifting toward the evening's events. There would be a formal dinner to celebrate the partnership, a mix of corporate formality and quiet networking. She would attend, make her presence known, and then disappear before the room grew too noisy with champagne and speculation. Upstairs in her suite, she stood by the window looking out over the city. Below, buses crawled along crowded streets, and pedestrians wove between them with practiced ease. It struck her how different this view was from the closed, pressurized world of the aircraft cabin. Here, she could choose her movements, direct her own flow. Her phone vibrated on the table, a message from Arthur Kim, the silver-haired passenger who had sat across from her on the flight. "Glad to see you landed well. The internet is a strange place this morning. I think you'd be pleased at how many people on our flight have been posting about what actually happened." She typed back, "Thank you for the note. Safe travels." There was satisfaction in knowing that the truth was circulating without her having to push it herself. That had been the plan all along, to act in such a way that others would tell the story for her, and that those stories would carry more weight than any manufactured outrage. That evening, the dinner unfolded exactly as expected. Polished speeches, discreet toasts, and the subtle but unmistakable hum of deals being discussed over dessert. Amani took her leave just after the main course, slipping out into the cool night air with the knowledge that her position in the project, in the partnership, and in the eyes of those who mattered was stronger than ever. Back in her room, she sat for a moment in the quiet, letting the day settle. The Atlantic crossing already felt like it belonged to another life. Zane Calder, wherever he was tonight, might still be scrolling, still searching for the spark of attention that had once been his to command. But here, in this city, among these circles, that spark had long since gone out. She reached for her notebook and began to outline the next steps for Project Aegis. The work was demanding, the stakes high, but that was exactly how she liked it. Challenges were simply another kind of flight you stayed on course, adjusted for headwinds, and landed where you intended. The room was quiet except for the faint hum of the city beyond the glass. Amani allowed herself a small, private smile. She had come through turbulence without raising her voice, without breaking stride. And, in doing so, she had reminded everyone watching, from the passengers in first class to the executives in the boardroom, exactly why she belonged at the controls of something far bigger than an aircraft. The morning after the dinner, London was wrapped in a light mist that softened the edges of buildings and muted the rumble of traffic. Amani stood at her hotel window, coffee in hand, watching the slow movement of people along the wet sidewalks. The city seemed unhurried, as if it had agreed to take a breath before the day began in earnest. Her phone vibrated on the desk, The message was from Helena Voss. "Thought you might appreciate this." It was a link to an industry newsletter, the kind that specialized in behind-the-scenes shifts in media influence. The headline read, "Former travel influencer loses major sponsorships after disputed flight incident." She opened it, scanning quickly. Several brands had quietly ended their contracts with Zane Calder, citing concerns about professionalism and reliability. There was no sensational language, no viral outrage, just the clinical phrasing of corporate distancing. She set the phone down. There was no satisfaction in seeing someone's livelihood crumble, but there was a certain symmetry. Actions had consequences, even in the curated chaos of social media. She took another sip of coffee and let the thought pass. Down in the lobby, the air was scented with fresh flowers and polish. A black sedan waited at the curb to take her to the Helios office for a closed-door strategy session. The driver held the door for her, offering a polite good morning. Inside the car, the city slid past in muted tones, the mist turning headlights into soft halos. At Helios, the mood was focused but light. The success of the Project Aegis signing had set the tone for the quarter, and teams were already mapping out the implementation phase. Helena greeted her with that same efficient warmth and led her into a smaller conference room than the day before. This one was all pale oak and muted fabric panels, a space designed for clarity rather than spectacle. They spent the morning aligning resources, adjusting timelines, and identifying potential friction points in the rollout. Amani moved through the discussion with the same steady presence she had carried across the Atlantic. Every question was met with a clear answer, every proposal weighed and either accepted or refined. By the time they broke for lunch, there was a shared sense that they were ahead of schedule. Over a simple meal in the executive lounge, Helena leaned in slightly. "You should know. Word about the flight has made its way through certain circles. Not the public version, the real one. It has done more for your credibility than any press release could." Amani set down her glass. "That was never the goal." "I know," Helena said, "which is why it worked. You don't chase the spotlight, but it seems to follow you when it matters." After lunch, there were only a few more hours of work before she was free. She declined an offer to be driven back to the hotel, choosing instead to walk a stretch along the Thames. The river was calm under the gray sky, the embankment dotted with people moving at their own paces, tourists with cameras, runners in bright jackets, a man feeding birds from a paper bag. She thought of the flight, of the moment Zane's voice had risen in that pressurized cabin. It had been such a small space to hold such a large wave of tension. In that moment, her instincts had told her to preserve her energy, to choose her ground carefully. That choice had not only contained the situation, but had quietly shifted the balance of power in ways that only became visible afterward. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was an email from Jonathan Pell at North Star Atlantic. "Just wanted to confirm that our internal review is complete. Both crew members involved have been reassigned away from premium cabins. We are instituting new training focused on bias awareness and passenger interaction. Thank you again for your patience and your example." She read it twice, noting the formal yet personal tone. This was as much about letting her know as it was about setting a record of acknowledgement. By late afternoon, she was back at the hotel, packing for her return to New York. Her flight would be in the morning, this time without ceremony or corporate escorts, just a seat, a few hours of quiet, and the Atlantic beneath her. She folded each piece of clothing with the same care she had taken with her presentation notes, her movements unhurried. Dinner that night was a solitary one at a small restaurant a few blocks away. She chose a corner table where she could see the door and the street beyond. The food was simple, the wine light, and the conversation around her a pleasant background hum. For the first time in days, she felt the absence of urgency. The deal was done, the turbulence behind her. On the walk back, the mist had lifted, revealing a clear night sky. The city lights shimmered on the river, and the air carried the faint scent of rain. She paused on a bridge, looking out over the water. Somewhere far below, currents moved unseen, guiding the river toward the sea. She thought about the invisible currents in her own life, the choices that seemed small at the time but carried her toward larger outcomes. In her room, she set her suitcase by the door and sat in the armchair by the window. The city stretched out before her, vast and indifferent. She took out her notebook and wrote a single line: "Stay the course. Adjust for headwinds. Land where you intend." It was not just about flights or business deals. It was about the quiet discipline of steering through moments that could easily pull you off track. She closed the notebook, switched off the light, and let the darkness settle. Tomorrow she would be back in the air, and soon after, back in the rhythm of New York. The headlines would move on, the online chatter would fade, and the people who mattered would remember only the part that counted, that she had been tested, and she had held steady. As she drifted toward sleep, the image of the Atlantic came to her vast, unbroken, and patient, like the ocean. Some truths did not need to shout to be heard. They simply were, and in their constancy, they shaped the world around them. In the end, the turbulence was never about the weather. It was about what happens when we choose to see or refuse to see the person in front of us. Dr. Amani Rhodes never raised her voice, never demanded the world bend to her will. She simply held her ground, and in doing so, reminded everyone that respect is not granted by status. It's earned by how we treat one another. For the crew members who let bias guide their actions, the consequences were swift and real. For Zane Calder, the fall from influence was quiet but complete. And for those watching passengers, executives, strangers online, a seed was planted that prejudice, however subtle, has no place in a world that depends on cooperation. We are left with a choice. Do we meet each other with assumptions, or with respect? Do we let the noise dictate the outcome, or do we trust in the quiet power of integrity? If this story moved you, if it made you feel, reflect, or even rethink, don't let it end here. Like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you'll be with us for the next journey.